and I'm delighted to rise this evening to speak against this bill. It is called something which is quite confusing. They refer to this bill as the Fair Work Legislation Amendment Secure Jobs Better Pay Bill of 2022. It should in fact read Insecure Jobs and Lower Standard of Living Bill, but nevertheless it has been the government's call as to what words to use. Many of my colleagues have already outlined some very good cases for why this bill should be opposed. Let me just focus on three. Firstly, this bill represents a dirty dividend to the union movement in Australia. Secondly, it is aimed at stoking division in Australian workplaces. And thirdly, it will leave the Australian economy and the Australian workers worse off, the economy weaker and workers poorer. But let's start with the dirty dividend, if we may. We have to remember that since 2007, $100 million has gone from the union movement in Australia to the Australian Labor Party. This is a dirty dividend between the union movement and the Labor Party. I remember that image, I believe it was from 1963. It was a photo of Arthur Calwell and Gough Whitlam, and they were only a few kilometres away from where we are now. They were outside the Kingston Hotel, the Kingo, and they were looking down, forlorn, melancholy, because inside, behind closed doors, were the puppeteers of the Labor Party, 36 unionists, determining the policies that the Labor politicians would take to that year's federal election. Times change a little, Deputy Speaker, because then they called them faceless puppeteers, faceless men. Nowadays, the unions need not stay behind closed doors. They are very happy to shout it loud that they are in control of the Labor Party, and they shout it as loudly as the Labor MPs in this place bow to them, unashamedly so. This is a dirty dividend, and we know it is when you have the likes of John Setka saying, as he has, that in regards to this legislation, we will have the power to go after non-union sites. Can I underscore that word power, Deputy Speaker? Power. This is precisely why the likes of John Setka is happy. And why wouldn't the CFMEU be happy? The CFMEU currently have around 30 representatives in front of the courts. Since we had re-established the Registered Organisations Committee and the ABCC, the Australian Building and Construction Commission, we have seen over 1,600 contraventions by the CFMEU. They've had to pay out penalties of over $17 million. Is it any wonder that the unions are delighted about this piece of legislation? A piece of legislation that, on the other side, has united all other major parts of the Australian economy. Businesses of all shapes and sizes, many of whom rarely unite, but they are absolutely united on this one because they know this is a dirty dividend for the unions of Australia, a deal between the Australian Labor Party and the Australian union movement. It's a dirty dividend and nothing more. But it's also, by its very nature, a piece of legislation that seeks to stoke division within Australia. almost trying to bring back that notion of class struggle between capital and labour. You might recall only a couple of years ago, in the midst of the pandemic, the then coalition government introduced JobKeeper, something that employers and employees across the country praised enormously. JobKeeper, at a time of crisis, was all about keeping employers and employees together, keeping them close together. This piece of legislation seeks to sever that relationship in half. This legislation seeks to divide employers from employees. This legislation is an ideological piece of work that not only delivers that dirty dividend to the union movement, but stokes conflict within the workplace. And we know that especially the multi-employer bargaining will increase the risk of widespread strikes, strike action. And there's a good reason why all representatives of the small business community are screaming about this piece of legislation. Not only does this welcome unions into workplaces where employers and employees have never needed them, but it takes business owners in small operations away from their core business at a time when they can afford it least. Because this legislation will force them to go and have to negotiate, bargain with other employers so they can come to some form of joint agreement. And if they do not have time to do that, and most small and medium businesses do not have the time to do that, they do not have the in-house expertise to do this, then they will stand by whatever terms and conditions other employers negotiate on their behalf. That's what they've got in this legislation. And ultimately, this leaves the Australian economy weaker and the Australian people poorer. In a high inflation environment, where we have rising interest rates, where we have low unemployment, what we really need in this country is a boost in productivity. Now, it is no surprise that the government's budget papers downgraded their assumption about growth in productivity. And while I support a lowering of the assumption of growth in productivity down to 1.2%, with pieces of legislation like this, I think this government has Buckley's chance of even reaching that. And when you look at total factor productivity and its two core parts, labour and capital, both need boosting in this country. Both will be adversely impacted by this legislation. Because we do know, due to the mass strikes, due to the conflict in the workplace, we will have less output from the input of labour, less output from the use of machines and equipment through capital. And we are a nation that imports investment, imports money. We are a net importer of capital. This does nothing to attract new investment. Overall, therefore, it will be a killer for productivity. And anyone who's learned any economics, anyone who's ever lived in the real-world economy, understands that the main driver for standard of living is productivity. Yet this bill kills productivity. In summary, Deputy Speaker, this is a piece of legislation that represents a dirty dividend from the Australian Labor Party to the Australian union movement. It is aimed at stoking division in the workplace, and it will leave the Australian economy weaker and ultimately the Australian people poorer. It's a return to the bad old days of the 70s, and it should be absolutely rejected.
Thank you.